Helicopters are probably as close as we ever got to that long sought-after dream of the flying car. Yet, the world quickly learned that this sci-fi dream was a terrible idea. As instituted in cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles in the late 1950s, there was actually a time when Americans were practically using helicopters as taxis. And if not for one fatal accident on July the 27th, 1960, maybe that would still be the case. So stay tuned to learn why, as today we remember the story of Chicago's lost Helicopter Airways. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's go back to the early decades of the 20th century, when people were obsessed with aviation. And it must have been quite a remarkable experience to witness this explosive growth, from the earliest flights to the development of fighters, passenger planes, and even helicopters. Surprisingly, the latter of which started development almost in tandem with fixed-winged airplanes. Their first successful tests happened as early as 1906, merely 3 years after the Wright brothers debuted their own aircraft. But when it comes to the first helicopter flight, well, that test was conducted by the Decay brothers in France and could not be considered untethered or unassisted, as the unstable craft had to be held by two people not to tip over. But it was nevertheless quite an achievement for the first decade of the 20th century. With those developments came the dream of incorporating aviation into everyday life, especially when considering things like the rapid development of aircraft during World War II, and then the emergence of the first mass-produced helicopter, the Sikorsky R-4. Hence, as it seemed at the time, the world was just ready to take over the skies. With that in mind, by 1946, the US government authorized the use of helicopters for civilian applications. Now, some suspect that this decision was taken in part as a necessity to keep their highly trained pilots engaged after the war. The first idea was to perform a 5-year experiment using helicopters in mail delivery. Which brings us to the incorporation of Chicago Helicopter Airways, known at that time as Helicopter Air Service. For a few years, various tests were conducted, including attempts to land on the roof of the Chicago post office and deliver mail at night. The company even looked into picking up and dropping mail with helicopters, but without landing. This actually made sense, as most fuel is typically consumed during the takeoff and climb stages of a flight. During those phases, the engines operate at maximum power to overcome gravity and achieve lift. The engineers involved in those early mail delivery trials devised an interesting idea. A bag with mail was suspended between two upright pylons, with a nylon rope stretched between them. From there, the helicopters used specialized hooks to catch the bag and later pull it up using a pulley system. However, in the end, this system was deemed too cumbersome and impractical for regular operations. Even so, after years of trials, in 1949, the company was finally ready to take on commercial operations. During their inaugural flight, a helicopter carried a pouch of domestic mail from the roof of Chicago's post office to the airmail service field at Midway. Soon, Chicago Helicopter Airways started providing these types of services to 54 outposts. Initially, just 2 helicopters were approved by the Civil Aeronautics Board, Sikorsky S-51 and Bell 47. These were the very first aircraft to serve with the Chicago Helicopter Airways. However, after a few years of operations, it became clear that helicopters were not a viable long-term solution to the postal challenges of post-war America. Their maximum weight lift needed to be increased, and the aircraft could not safely operate within a cloud base of under 500 feet. A notion that, in conjunction with the U.S. Post Office's mission statement, was completely unacceptable. In other words, the company had to look for other avenues, so they turned to passenger flights instead. By the late 1950s, thanks to the widespread adoption of cars, traffic was already becoming a significant problem for American cities. So, to combat this issue, a government program was introduced providing grants to companies brave enough to carry passengers in helicopters. Chicago Helicopter Airways promptly answered the call, and its first passenger flight took place in 1956. The company soon started carrying regular flights between O'Hare, Midway International, and Meigs Field. Beyond that, they flew to Winnetka, Illinois and Gary, Indiana. Their Winnetka location was significant, as this small town, located 16 miles north of downtown Chicago, is, and for a long time has been, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the United States. Established in 1836, it quickly started to develop into one of the most affluent communities in Illinois, thanks to its scenic location and relative proximity to the city. In the 1940s and 50s, it was home to more than 12,000 people, including celebrities such as Rock Hudson, known for his 1956 role in Giant, as well as Anne Margaret, who starred in Viva Las Vegas. Other notable people associated with the town include Rocky Wirtz, who was the owner of the Chicago Blackhawks, and then of course let's not forget the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. In other words, Winnetka was a rather elite enclave. Anyhow, the airport from which Chicago Helicopter Airways operated in the town was located on Willow Road, near the old garbage dump. The community enjoyed 2 inbound flights and 2 outbound flights every weekday. The helicopters arrived at 7:27 a.m. and 6:22 p.m., with departures occurring at 7:29 a.m. and 6:24 p.m. Now, if 2 minutes between arrival and departure seems a little bit short to you, you're entirely right, a fact that will become important later in our story. The passengers could get from O'Hare to Winnetka in about 8 minutes, which meant that they could leave at 7:29 a.m. and land at O'Hare at 7:37, or midway by 7:50. A service which indeed seems perfect for Hollywood superstars and business moguls. During its peak in the 1960s, Chicago Helicopter Airways operated 126 daily flights and transported up to 6,000 passengers daily. The opportunity to skip that horrific Chicago traffic and get to a major airport within minutes and almost directly from your house was a big draw for passengers. And the story gets better. You see, in addition to being an exciting novelty, the flights were also quite affordable. For example, one could travel from Winnetka to O'Hare for just $5. Adjusted for inflation, that translates to about $50 in today's money, which is still rather affordable for a helicopter ride, if I dare say so myself. For just $11, you could book a scenic tour of Chicago. The flights were advertised as cheap, convenient, and, most of all, safe. Unfortunately, though, that last part proved to be somewhat untrue. On July the 27th, 1960, at 10:15 p.m., one of the prized Sikorsky S-58 helicopters arrived at Midway International en route to O'Hare Airport, where, after a brief stop, it departed back at approximately 10:30. Then, just a short time later, a part of the main rotor blade broke off when flying over Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park. The crew attempted an emergency landing, but either due to a part of the broken rotor damaging the tail cone or due to structural stress, the helicopter's tail cone and tail rotor also broke away. The helicopter spun its nose down and impacted the ground, killing everyone on board. 2 crew members and 11 passengers perished in this crash. Later, an investigation concluded that structural fatigue of the main rotor was the most likely culprit of the disaster. Well, it's possible that in the 1960s, some of the company's fleet still consisted of repurposed military helicopters. The aircraft in question was a relatively new unit. It was built in 1957 and initially delivered to New York Airways, but was sold to Chicago Helicopter Airways later. So, while it is hard to definitively state that the company was overexploiting its fleet, merely 15-minute stops between passenger flights does seem like a very short time, one that wouldn't allow for any mechanical inspection or proper checks. I'm hoping that someone out there is an aviation expert who can let us all know in the comments if such a short turnaround time is standard practice for commercial helicopter flights. That 1960 disaster was the beginning of Chicago Helicopter Airways' end. The company experienced a sharp decline in public trust. The crash was highly publicized, and the carrier had undergone significant public scrutiny. By 1963, traffic had decreased by approximately 50%, with only 3,000 passengers per day. Meaning, by this time, Chicago Helicopter Airways found it difficult to keep its lights on, though the government was still subsidizing helicopter transportation, but that revenue stream was also about to run dry. By 1965, both the administration and Congress were eager to terminate subsidies for helicopter programs. Congress actually wanted to cut the funds right away, but the administration recommended the program be cut at the end of the calendar year of 1965. The rationale behind this decision was that only 3 companies took advantage of the program: helicopter commuter services in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Therefore, lawmakers argued that the companies needed a perspective of becoming profitable, as they would either go bankrupt or require endless funding to remain operational. And most likely, they were right. Faced with that reality, Chicago Helicopter Airways suspended its service in 1966. For 3 years, most of its fleet was idle or just occasionally used for different purposes. That is until 1969, when it attempted a comeback. Chicago Helicopter Airways reopened some of its previous routes, but without government subsidies. And as they found out, it was almost impossible to maintain the operations. Limited or deferred maintenance and a lack of resources meant that the tragedy of Flight 698 could happen again at any point. Therefore, the company closed down permanently in 1974. With that being said, while Chicago Helicopter Airways did fail as a business enterprise, its story is an inspiring tale of an America in which the romantic idea of a technological future remained a real possibility. As to many back then, it seemed like helicopter commuting was just a stepping stone towards flying cars and other marvels of technology promised to us all by 1950s science fiction. And perhaps what's even more amazing, and what I can't imagine, is that people paid just $5 for a helicopter ride. And allow me to put that fact into perspective. For the most part, that's cheaper than a slice of Chicago-style deep dish pizza. A fact that I learned when covering the history of Chicago deep dish pizza on our limited series, Eats History. We also attempted to bake one of those pizzas at home, which was a miserable fail. It's actually pretty funny and embarrassing, so you can click right here to check that out. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.